The All Blacks have their last match of the calendar year up against the Welsh this weekend, and with that loss to England, there has been a huge amount of criticism towards Scott Robertson and his All Blacks side in regards of whether or not they were getting selections right throughout these November internationals. Now, I will mention in this video, I am not predicting what Scott Robertson will be selecting. That will be coming out a little bit later on once we get a couple of injury updates, but this lineup, it is what I would like to see up against the Welsh. Now, this is not one of those situations where all of a sudden, because of a loss, I am starting to make rotation in my side. As some of you will know, all throughout November, I've been giving my lineups, and there was a lot more rotation in those ones than we have seen. But jumping straight into it, for this matchup up against the Welsh, I believe you can afford to go experimental. There isn't a lot to gain for those guys who have already played many minutes throughout 2025, whereas in this game, it may be the one opportunity that some of these young players could end up having. But in the front row, I would go with number 1, Tamaiti Williams, number 2, Samisoni Taukei'aho, and number 3, Pasili Otosi. These are 3 men who, making their way off the bench for the All Blacks all throughout November, have been able to bring an impact onto the field. We have seen Ethan de Groot, Cody Taylor and Fletcher Newell in every single match of the November internationals, so this would be a great change to see what these 3 can do in a starting lineup situation rather than making their way off of the bench. In the locking duo, I would go number 4, Josh Lord, and number 5, Fabian Holland. Now, Fabian Holland was an extremely unfortunate exclusion from the game up against the English. He has been one of the standout locks for New Zealand all throughout 2025, and he only made his debut in that French series. But Josh Lord, he has thoroughly impressed a lot of people with what he's been able to do for the All Blacks. Initially brought into the squad as injury cover earlier in the year and working his way into a regular squad position. Him and Fabian Holland worked very nicely together. We saw that in the game up against the Scottish, where the lineouts were functioning and doing very well. And I do think in this type of matchup, you don't need Scott Barrett in the starting lineup. I have got him off the bench for this contest to have a little bit more of a late impact. I do know that the All Blacks are trying to get that balance right between their starting lineup and also the reserves. So in this scenario, I go Lord and Holland starting and have Scott Barrett making his way off the bench. In the loose forward trio, a little bit of a switch from what we did see up against the English. Number 6, Wallace Satiti. Number 7, Artie Savia, and he would also be my captain for this Welsh fixture. And number 8, Peter Larkai. I do think that Peter Larkai has been a great find for New Zealand. Everyone who's watched him in the NPC as well as Super Rugby knew that if he was given that international chance, he would absolutely make the most of it. And for me, he's almost secured that number 8 jersey. Yes, there'll be a bit of competitiveness if we see some sort of reshuffle in the future. Perhaps Wallace Satiti starts to go back to number 8. But for now, I would place Satiti as the 6. Because of that height of Josh Lord and Fabian Holland, I don't think you necessarily need another big tall 6 option in this contest. Someone like a Simon Parker, who was starting in that last match up against the English, but it just seemed like Wallace Satiti, when he made his way off the bench, it didn't seem like he had enough time out there on the field. So hopefully by starting him up against the Welsh, he gets into his work early. Now, we did see that brutal injury of Jack Morgan for the Welsh, which was a massive shame. He is an absolutely outstanding player, but I do think if New Zealand went Satiti, Savia as the skipper, and Larkai as the 8, they would do extremely well up against this Welsh side. Moving on to the backline, this is where there's a little bit of uncertainty around Cam Roigard at the moment. He did limp off the field in the game up against the English with a bit of an ankle injury after a maul did fall on him awkwardly. Now, at this point in time, they have not released any sort of injury update about Cam Roigard, so that could be considered as either a good thing because it's all been cleared, or a bad thing because he's still getting scans and everything to work out the extent of the injury. So I haven't taken the risk of putting him in the starting lineup for this contest, instead going Cortez Ratama as the starting 9 with Damian McKenzie slotting in at 10. I do think that Beauden Barrett has been under a huge amount of pressure throughout these November internationals, and I actually mentioned it on the live stream. Up against Ireland, Scotland and England, I can't think of a match out of those 3 where Beauden Barrett has played better than the man in the opposition number 10 jersey. First match, Jack Crowley doing pretty decently for Ireland. Match up against Scotland, Finn Russell well and truly outclassed Beauden Barrett, and then that game up against the English, George Ford, I mean, what a masterclass we saw from that man. So for Beauden, he has had pressure from the get-go. He's been missing kicks for touch. He's been making mistakes on attack, and I think he's just due a break. And you would assume that he will come back better for next season. Scott Robertson, he will still be backing him throughout 2026, but in this case, I would go with McKenzie. The impact that he's been able to have off the bench. I know a lot of people have also said they would just throw Ruben Love straight into the 10 jersey, and trust me, I've thought about it, but I also do think with the limited amount of minutes that we've seen from Ruben Love, trying to throw him in the deep end in his secondary position. We've got to remember he is a fullback at heart. Yes, he's been playing a little bit of 10 throughout Super Rugby, but no international experience in the 10 jersey could really be feeding him to the wolves in this type of matchup at the Principality. But I would go with Cortez Ratama as that starting 9. No other options other than Finlay Christie, who I do think outside of this year's probably just about on the out of this All Black side. When you look at the youngsters like a Dylan Pledger, they've got Xavier Rowe, Falau Fakatava, Noah Hotham, Kyle Preston. There are plenty of guys who I feel in the long term are more likely to get minutes than Finlay Christie. But we move on to the midfield combo, and this is where I would stick with what we saw in the last match up against England. Number 12, Quintal Pyer. Number 13, Billy Proctor. Proctor got a huge amount of stick for his performance up against England, but that is because of the weird rivalry thing that is happening at the moment between people who like Leicester Whaiananuku and people who like Billy Proctor. But Proctor, for me, in that game up against England, actually had one of his better performances in an All Blacks kit. He worked well with Quintal Pyer, and I don't think that that midfield combo was actually the problem on attack for New Zealand throughout that matchup. But Proctor making some great decisions, some brilliant tackles thrown in there too. Quintal Pyer, the battering ram, as a number 12, certainly looking like he can fill that role if Jordie Barrett is out with an injury, or perhaps some would even argue should get that starting opportunity, with Barrett either being reshuffled into a different spot or off the bench as impact. But Quintal Pyer and Billy Proctor, I think they'd do very nicely up against the Welsh for this contest, so I'm keeping them together in those two jerseys. The back 3 now. Number 11, back to Caleb Clarke. He was out last week with a concussion. The All Blacks, they thoroughly needed his work under the high ball up against England, who were able to control the kicking contest. We did see quite a few aerial challenges, just not quite going the All Blacks way. So by having Caleb Clarke back out there, I feel like you very much so increase your chances of getting 1 or 2 of those high balls back. Number 14, this is where I've made a bit of a switch. Leroy Carter, his last 2 performances, they've been a little bit lower than the standard that we saw in the initial stages of Leroy Carter's career. So for that reason, I'll give him a spell in this contest and go with Will Jordan out on the right wing, someone who has actually been doing very well under the high ball for the All Blacks as of late. So by putting him into the 14 jersey, you free up the opportunity for a certain player in his preferred position, but also you have that safety of the high ball with Will Jordan out on the right. And then at number 15, this is where I believe you play Ruben Love up against the Welsh. Yes, you could chuck him in at 10, but when you look through at the 10 stocks in terms of the future options for New Zealand, let's be honest, first of all, Scott Robertson's looking for Richie Mo'unga to be back at number 10, and perhaps he will be the guy that takes over for Beauden Barrett, and maybe we still see McKenzie as that impact player off of the bench. But then you've got all these other young first fives. Josh Jacob, Braves Reihana, Harry Godfrey, Cam Miller, just to name a few. I think that Ruben Love's better chance of getting opportunities for New Zealand is to be playing as a backup fullback for Will Jordan. Now, I don't see a way that he gets into the starting lineup consistently without Will Jordan playing out on the right wing, which at the moment doesn't seem like a terrible option for this game up against the Welsh. But Ruben Love, he's a strong young player. He probably does lack a little bit of confidence out there on the field, purely because of the fact that when he has been given opportunities, it's about 2 or 3 minutes at the end of a game. But I would stick him at 15 here, see what he can do up against the Welsh. Moving on to the bench now, and I have made a few changes compared to what we saw in the last match up against England. Number 16, George Bell. Number 17, George Bauer, so 2 Georges off the reserves bench. And then number 18, Fletcher Null. So an all Crusaders front row. George Bell was brought into the side for Brodie McAllister, and we haven't seen him yet in any of the contests. So I don't know whether or not he's in Scott Robertson's long-term plan, or whether he was just warming that spot for a Samoa more when he returns. But George Bell, from what we saw in the Bunnings NPC, he's a dangerous enough option in that 16 or number 2 jersey, and hopefully he gets some sort of crack here for the match. On the weekend, George Bauer, the reason I've gone with him over an Ethan de Groot is I purely feel like de Groot's played far too many minutes throughout 2025, not because of his skill or not because of his form, just purely because as the seasons wore on, we've slowly seen his body deteriorate. We saw him go off the field early up against the English, and that was probably just from fatigue as well as taking those knocks week in, week out. So I'd go George Bauer 17, and then number 18. This is where you could look at the debut for Tavita Mafaleo, but I do think that he was only brought in really as that Lomax replacement. So that's where I go Fletcher Null, have all those Crusaders together off of the bench so that George Bell, the youngster, has that nice bit of support from his Crusaders teammates like he would have throughout Super Rugby. Number 19, another Crusader here. This is where I would play Scott Barrett in this scenario. You could go with Sam Derry in that 19 jersey instead, but Scott Barrett, he's had limited game time throughout the November internationals. We saw him up against England only briefly in their match up against the Irish, and I do see Scott Barrett as a decent impact player off of the bench for the Kiwis. That is another thing that has been so inconsistent with the All Blacks, is what they're able to do in that last 20 minutes. Now, up against Ireland, it was phenomenal. Up against Scotland, it was just enough from Damian McKenzie as well as Wallace Satiti to be able to change that game around. And then in the game up against England, up against the POM squad, as they've been labelled, there was no impact whatsoever from that All Blacks bench. So Scott Barrett, he should be able to add a little bit more to that. Number 20, I have gone with Simon Parker. So once again, a player who is versatile. He's got plenty of size, power about him too, and he would be a decent replacement for anyone in that loose forward trio. Back replacements, if he is match fit, I would go with Cam Roigard here to be able to add a nice bit of pace and a little bit of extra excitement off the bench for the New Zealanders. Of course, if he is injured, then that only leaves you with Finlay Christie as that number 21. Number 22, Leicester Fainanuku. Now, it gets me in trouble saying that I'd love to see Leicester used as an impact player for the All Blacks off the bench, similar to what we've seen Damian McKenzie do so well throughout this year. The fact that Leicester can offer you the centres as well as out on the wings, he is the perfect versatile type of player to have making his way off the bench. He has got power, he's got attacking ability. One thing he gets critiqued about is his defence. He's missed a huge amount of tackles throughout November, but you can't hold that against him, because if you do, people get very angry after waiting so long to see Fainanuku back in the AB's environment. But I would definitely, in this type of match, don't get me wrong, Scott Robertson will probably start him, but I can just imagine Leicester making his way onto the field last 25 minutes and then just absolutely causing chaos for a tiring Welsh side. Number 23, Beauden Barrett. Now, I think that Scott Robertson is probably due to give Barrett a break. But similar to Ethan de Groot, he's had a huge amount of minutes throughout 2025. But for Beauden Barrett, his confidence has to be pretty low at the moment. He has had a few poor matches in quick succession. It's just not quite going right for him. So I also think that in this scenario, you reverse what you've been doing with Damian McKenzie and Beauden, and you go with McKenzie's starting lineup and give Barrett the opportunity to show how much of an impact player he can be off the bench. We saw him do it up against England in 2024, making his way onto the field and having a game-changing type of role for the All Blacks, but it's just about rotating a little bit here. You could actually look at someone in that 23 jersey like a Anton Leonard-Brown, a Sevu Reece, a Rieko Ioane, but of all those options, I still think I would go with Beauden Barrett as that number 23 option. But nonetheless, that is my All Black side that I would like to see up against Wales. Of course, quick disclaimer, this is nothing like what we're going to see from Scott Robertson. In fact, I'll be honest, I have no idea what Robertson's going to be doing for this contest. He will either go pretty much full strength again and try and get a statement victory over the Welsh, or he will start making those switches that perhaps should have been made a little bit earlier on in the year. We might see a debut or two. We may see some guys who haven't played throughout November, but either way, it is an extremely intriguing contest as the All Blacks, they want to bounce back, make it 3 from 4 for their November internationals. But of course, let me know who you would like to see in this All Black side taking on the Welsh this weekend. And as soon as the side is announced, I will of course be letting you know on the channel too. But thank you all very much for tuning in. If you did enjoy, Be sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all for the next one.